Good evening. Hello, everyone. I said to Helena, this is a podium evening. We don't always do that at Gibbs, but today it feels appropriate. So good evening, colleagues, esteemed guests, members of the Gibbs family and the broader University of Pretoria community. My name is Louise Whitaker. I am the Deputy Dean here at Gibbs. Today I'm also the Acting Dean because our Dean is traveling on behalf of Gibbs. I think he's in Zanzibar of all places. And I'm also not acting at all. Let me be very clear about that, but I am standing in for very momentarily the Vice Chancellor, who is very sad to not be here tonight. He was looking forward to welcoming you all, but unfortunately he's ill and he's had to give his apologies. And so he asked me to welcome you all on his behalf. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 35th lecture in the University of Pretoria Expert Lecture Series, a platform that celebrates individual excellence, research impact, and the power of ideas to shape society. This series is one of the Vice Chancellor and Principal's long-standing initiatives to shine a spotlight on exceptional researchers at UP, those who not only advance knowledge in their fields, but engage meaningfully with the world beyond academia, which is partly, I suppose, what we are doing here tonight. These lectures showcase science and scholarship, more broadly speaking, science, in service of society, opening up complex questions for broader reflection and enabling us to learn from each other across disciplines, across sectors, across perspectives. I do encourage you to explore some of the inspiring prior lectures in this series, which are available online, and they offer a rich archive of thought leadership on topics ranging from climate resilience, artificial intelligence, to public health, economic justice, biodiversity, the future of democracy. The series really is a window into the critical work being done here at the University of Pretoria. The timing of this lecture is very fitting because in the last few years, the University of Pretoria has seen a marked increase in research outputs, clearly evidenced that the goals outlined in the long-term strategy UP 2025 are being realized. Over 75% of academic staff at UP hold doctoral degrees, and I'm pleased to say that at Gibbs here that number is over 80. And this really is a significant marker not only of our research capacity, but also of our supervisory capability. And it is a pleasure tonight to welcome some of our doctoral students and soon to be doctoral graduates to this event. Today, UP is recognized not only for the volume, which is one thing, but really the quality and relevance and impact of its research. Beyond rankings, we take even greater pride in how our research speaks to real-world challenges, from addressing poverty, inequality, and health disparities to harnessing innovation for sustainable development and environmental well-being. A growing network of global and local partners, multi-stakeholder collaborations, and what we are pushing really hard for, which is the increasingly interdisciplinary nature of our work, are central to UP's identity as a leading research-intensive university in Africa. The university seeks to build on areas of established strength while remaining agile enough to engage with new frontiers of knowledge and innovation. So it goes without saying that all of this progress would not be possible without the collective commitment and excellence of our researchers. Those who hold NRF ratings, such as Professor Barnard, those who are recognized as academic achievers, as others are tonight in this room, and those who contribute daily to the intellectual and societal fabric of our institution. We honor that commitment through initiatives like this lecture series. And so I thank you today for joining us in engaging, in learning, in contributing to the dialogue. We are really excited to share this space with you as we share another powerful example of the scholarship that defines UP. So let us turn our attention now to today's expert lecture and expert lecturer. Today we are privileged to hear from one of UP's most distinguished researchers, Professor Helena Barnard, who will speak on the topic migration, an integrative overview. I think, yes, it's on the screen. Helena is a full professor at Gibbs and is responsible for the Gibbs doctoral program. There is an extensive profile in the brochure that you have, but I'll give you a slightly shorter overview in my introduction. Her research interests are in how knowledge, and with it technology, organizational practices, and innovation move between more and less developed countries, particularly in Africa. She researches both organizational mechanisms, notably multinationals and internet-enabled businesses, and individual mechanisms, such as scientific collaborations, doctoral training, and the diaspora. Professor Barnard has published in the Journal of Management, the Journal of International Business Studies, Research Policy, all 4-star rated journals, as well as the Journal of World Business and others. Her paper on religion as an institution in Africa, together with her colleague, Professor Anastasia Mamabolo, hello Anna, won the 2023 Best Paper Award at the Journal of World Business. Helena was the Academy of International Business Vice President for Administration from 2017 to 2020. Trying to imagine why one would want to be the Vice President for Administration, but I guess the Deputy Dean is not the person to ask that question, and is currently the founding chairperson of the Emerging Markets Special Interest Group of AIB. From 2018 to 2019, she was a Dunning Fellow at the John H. Dunning Center for International Business at the University of Reading. She has been an area editor for the Journal of International Business Policy since the founding of the journal, and an area editor for the Academy of Management Perspectives for the 2024 to 2027 term. She has also served as deputy editor at Management and Organizational Review and the editor in charge of international business research for the Africa Journal of Management. Professor Barnard has also been an invited speaker on emerging market multinationals at, amongst others, the Aalborg University in Denmark, Northeastern in Boston, the European International Business Academy in Sussex, and NYU. Since then, she has focused specifically on Africa and was, for example, the keynote speaker for the AIB Digitalization, it's a tongue twister, shared interest group, where she spoke on how digital business opportunities are transforming Africa. Helena has published on global academic collaborations with collaborators from the University of Strasbourg and Maastricht and with the Oxford Internet Institute. She has been rated as an internationally recognized scholar by the South African National Research Foundation and was inducted as a fellow of the Academy of International Business in 2025. Before she started her academic career, and Helena pointed out to me she's very proud of this particular citation, she worked at Home Depot in the USA from 1999 to 2004, first in instructional design and then in logistics, which explains the administrative, yes, got it, okay. Her first career was in the field of adult basic education and training. I have no doubt that today, in characteristic fashion, Helena will bring to a conversation on migration both depth and breadth, because she has a deep knowledge of not just international business and the exchange of knowledge, but what underpins it. And she is here to help us think more expansively and more humanely about migration in our world today. Her work reminds us that research is not merely about discovery, but also about integration, connecting insights across disciplines, borders, and communities in service of society. I am sure that this 35th lecture in the expert series will be as thought-provoking and inspiring as the many that have come before it, as well as those still to come. So I welcome you again, and please do enjoy the lecture. I call on Professor Helena Barnard to deliver the 35th UP expert lecture. Thank you. We're going to watch a video.
We believe that within every moment of every day lies the potential to change the world. And by the good we do today, we can positively impact our futures. It's a single idea that holds everything together. Make today matter. Every day we nurture and build people through the knowledge we share and the things we have discovered. That's why knowledge matters. Through unique insights and by seeing the world differently, we write our own story of excellence. This is why opinions matter. Every day, we strive together to be Africa's leading research-intensive university, recognized internationally for our quality, relevance, and impact. This is why research matters. We learn, grow, and inspire because our standard is built on a strong foundation. This is why excellence matters. Our different backgrounds, experiences, culture, and history culminate in a unique strength that shapes our potential. That's why diversity matters. We never stop questioning, pushing, discovering, yearning in our pursuit of knowledge. This is why learning matters. We produce socially impactful research to find solutions to the world's most pressing issues. This is why sustainability matters. We inspire, we enable, we engage. Together, we transform knowledge into positive impact for the future. This is why impact matters. The University of Pretoria. This is how we make today matter.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, let me grab my water. I am a product of the University of Pretoria. I was 6 when I visited Liva Haxi at the Drama Theatre next to my primary school. My high school touched the university. I did my undergrad, my master's degrees at University of Pretoria, and I do understand that if the rector was not here because he's unwell, but on the program it said we need to watch the video. It really matters to the University of Pretoria. So apologies for that. To my family and friends, to my colleagues and students, and to those of you who are actually here because you're interested in the topic, especially you, I really hope that the next hour will be of value to you. So the word migrate means to move place, and we use the term whenever a consequential move has taken place. So domestically, it could be something like from a rural urban area. In China, there's a big move towards educational opportunities. In South Africa, there's semigration, which is essentially for lifestyle reasons. But most of the time when we speak about migration, we mean international migration. And that's what I mean in this topic. When we define international migration as basically an individual living in a different place to where they were born and raised, which means that we deal with an individual and then also with a sending or home or origin country and with a receiving or host or destination country. Now, there's scholars of migration who have a problem with foregrounding the country so much. They say we should instead be focusing on the individual who is trying to live in a specific place, who has to navigate all these processes of borders and boundary makings. Now, as Africans, I think we all know that boundaries are sometimes pretty arbitrary, but they're real and they shape where people can live, what they can do. And for that reason, I'm going to focus on migration and how it's shaped by countries, but I'm also going to talk about so-called illegal, or what I prefer, undocumented migrants, where people are not going through those formal processes. When we think about migration in terms of countries, let's just get clarity about the countries. And I use a global economic hierarchy kind of model, very simple: high, middle, and low income countries. High income countries are countries with sophisticated and dynamic economies, institutions that generally work, whether they are health, education, security, and governance systems that function well. In low income countries, none of those things really are present. And middle income countries obviously fall somewhere in the middle. But they're not, as we would in Afrikaans say, gemiddeld or average. Instead, what characterizes middle income countries is variability. They are characterized by economies that have some firms that are really world-class, that can compete internationally and do compete internationally, as well as areas which are really incredibly basic and often desperately poor. In terms of institutions, something like our financial services institutions are very, very strong. But there are also countless examples of institutions that are just simply failing. And the governance process is similarly, there is some averageness, but more frequently there's this coexistence of real excellence, real despondency, and then some averageness in between. It's also not really a surprise that the countries with the highest income inequality are all middle income countries. South Africa, Brazil, Thailand, Colombia, and even a country like India, which was always relatively equal, has seen increased inequality as it has grown economically. Because what you see is these patches of excellence, and then still as existing alongside it, these areas of underdevelopment. So if we look at the perspective of sending countries, it's really, there are not many structural incentives for people who are already living in high-income countries to undertake the challenging move to migrate. There's some anecdotal evidence of people who want to move for tax reasons or better quality of life. The evidence that is available is of star scientists, people who don't necessarily move between countries as much as between islands of innovation inside of countries. So somebody at a research institute in the US who might move to a research institute of similar or higher standing in Switzerland at CERN or wherever. We also know that these kinds of people would be very sensitive to policy changes. They want to go the best of the best for the best. And they would be happy to move to more unequal societies within a high income country. So a Dane might be very comfortable to move to Denmark because they are the winners in this area. But you can see that there's not really an incentive for people who live in high income countries to undertake that difficult move. People who live in low income countries, by and large, to a greater extent, would love to be in countries where you don't have the kind of poverty, the kind of dysfunctional institutions, the kind of sort of, very often there's violence or dictatorships. For them, migration is an attractive opportunity for many of them. But they've been let down by their countries because they're not really attractive to other people, because the institutions are so weak, because the economies are so weak. They don't have the education or the work experience to make them attractive for another country. So it shouldn't be a surprise, and it has been for decades the case, that the biggest source countries for migrants are middle-income countries. If we look at the large middle-income countries, China, Russia, India, they are the biggest source countries of migrants in the world. If we normalize by the size of the population, other important countries are Mexico, Pakistan, the Philippines, Turkey, Venezuela. South Africa doesn't make it on the list, but I think as I talk, we can all see that South Africa fits squarely in that bucket, where the country has enough strengths for people to develop skills and experience that make them attractive in other countries, but there's enough uncertainty that a possible migrant may consider it worthwhile to undertake the difficulties of undertaking migration. However, it's not altogether self-evident whether they should go. And in fact, when I did a search with stay, go, migrate, in the search engines, I got dozens of papers dealing with the question, should I stay or should I go, from all kinds of territories. Most papers not very good, but it shows that people are really grappling with the question of whether they should stay or whether they should go. And this is for two reasons. The first one is that the people who have the means to be accepted as a migrant into another country are typically the recipients of the unevenly distributed opportunities in their home country. So their life is generally quite good. There's a wonderful study in India about residents' welfare associations and what they canvass local government for. If the residents' welfare associations are in poor communities, there's one clear winner: basic services. Give us water, give us electricity. In the more affluent areas, it's things like, please maintain the parks, and can we gate this road so that we have quieter streets? And the people who can become migrants are the people who are worried about the maintenance of the parks, not the people who most desperately need to get to places where they have access to water or electricity. So typically what we see is therefore that migration goes with an eye towards the future. And in South Africa, we have for the sake of my children, or in case it becomes like Zimbabwe. So there's generally not a mention of the moment, but of what could happen at a later point in time. At the same time, there are huge emotional costs to the story, and likely also economic costs, because we know there's discrimination against people when they arrive in a foreign country because the foreign market cannot access accurately the experience. So we very well known in labor economics, people are not paid enough for the work that they offer. We see in South Africa that migrants leave in waves. Since 1948, it's been the big wave of migration. And since then, it has recurred in waves. And I did a study with a student on using social contagion as a lens to explain migration. And I would like to point out this was before COVID, when we did not understand as a general population what it means to be caught in a peak or another, or at the up or the downside of a peak. But what we did is Homecoming Revolution had data about why people emigrate. So we were able to construct a typology of why people immigrate. Older people go typically to reunify with family. Mid-career professional people go for two reasons, and it's racially divided. Black people tend to go more for pull reasons in terms of global growth opportunities, and white people push reasons: fear for crime, fear for not getting jobs, fear for their children's future. And youngsters go because they want to earn hard currency and have an adventure. So we could come up with this typology and then superimpose that on Stats SA data. And then, not me, because my mathematics ability is not super fantastic, but his was amazing. Do mathematical models and introduce shocks into the system, both positive and negative. Positive would be a World Cup win, negative would be load shedding, and see what it did to people's migration intentions. And social contagion works on three basic outcomes. You're susceptible, you can get ill. It's like common cold. The one is recovered. You had it and now you are not at all committed to leave. Or the other one is infected. You're unwell and you're going to leave. The remarkable thing that we found that was, no matter what models we did, and this is across the population and extrapolating from those motives, only 5% of people were committed to staying. At any given point, 95% of the responses were either considering to leave or committed to leaving. Now, of course, given education in this country, given that many of the people in that data set just wouldn't ever have the opportunity to leave. But I think this raises interesting questions around the fabric of society to begin with. I think for the rest of us, it answers the question, am I mad, or is everybody talking about migration all the time? And it seems people have stopped talking about migration all the time. Like now it feels as if we're not talking about it quite so much, if I'm not mistaken. It's like a COVID wave. It really comes and goes in intensity. It is always present. We are not getting away from this uncertainty. We're not in a population of people who are certain about whether we should stay or leave, which I think is interesting implications for us, but also for other middle income countries like us in terms of migration and how to make sense of what's happening in this context. So let me talk about what happens when people decide to move. Because most of the documented migrants go to high-income countries that have generally better institutions, we know quite well what happens to them. And it's really quite remarkable how many positives there are. So even the European video mentions innovation as a cornerstone of how we advance, and there's an extensive literature documenting the links between innovation and migration. It is one of the most robust findings when it comes to migration. Innovation involves doing things in new and better ways, and migrants bring at least the new ways. They see things differently, they do things differently, they've experienced things differently. So what migrants do is they introduce the novelty, and if you work with migrants, it becomes easier to see ways to make innovation work. Close to 10% of all patents have been patented by migrants. And after migration, an inventor becomes 23% more productive. This is not only in periods of exclusive migration. The US went through a period of mass migration from 1870 to 1940. During which 30 million people migrated to the US. And what we can see there is at the city level, people, you see more inventions, but also that if migrants were from a certain region that had certain technologies, those technologies started showing up in patterns, first the patterns of those newcomers, but then the patterns of the locals, as the migrants were teaching the newcomers the new technologies. So the migrants were really ways of introducing new ways of doing into their host communities. So this also happens actually for unicorn firms. When we look at unicorn firms, 40% of unicorn firms have migrants as part of their founding teams. It also holds when we look beyond exceptionally gifted people. I remember reading about this and like, yes, but I know some people who've immigrated that I would not regard as exceptionally gifted. They would not start a unicorn firm. Well, that doesn't seem to matter either. We know, first of all, teaching, nursing, hospitality, construction have long been important migration sectors. There's now work emerging that multinationals are importing manufacturing workers into other countries. So Hungary, for example, the typically former Soviet Union, has a very strong science education system, not terribly practical. Its factories needed more manufacturing workers. They imported workers, facilitated the migration of workers from the Philippines, very carefully chosen to also be Catholic so that there's similarity culturally. And you see that multinationals are even now starting to support migration at that lower level. We also know that if a firm is in a given city, headquartered in a city with a lot of migrants, it's more likely to internationalize to that country. And the effect is more pronounced if those migrants are from a poorer country, probably because the migrants are useful sources of information about that country. The point about these low and middle income countries is they're not necessarily very good at advertising themselves, but migrants are sources who can explain, no, this is what it's like and this is what you need to do to succeed there. So what we see is that migrants facilitate the international growth of firms from the host country back to their home country. Greater economic growth, and recent findings found that even if the migration is temporary, the long-term economic benefits last because the migrants pay taxes during the time that they are there that help to lift the economy into a different level. So it feels almost too good to be true, but there's an economist who points out that migrants are self-selected. So migrants have a goal to further their education, to do cutting-edge research, to earn more money. And as they pursue that goal, they are likely to also benefit the country in which they are pursuing that goal. And the diversity of migrants brings this energy that is associated with economic growth. Again, an effect that is actually stronger for low and middle income countries than it is for high income countries. But with diversity also comes difference, and with difference comes sort of social tension and potential conflict. And there is a recurring concern about excess labor, is the term that's typically used. And I want to quote directly this one quote because I think it's said very nicely. There's a reservation that should a shortage of jobs arise, immigration ought to be curtailed to the extent necessary to protect the employment opportunities of American citizens. This was done in America. This attitude is not new, end of quote. What I think we've heard comments like this recently about the need to protect our jobs and to limit migration. What I love about the quote is it was published in 1963. It's more than 60 years ago. This attitude is not new. He was referring back to the 1930s when that view was first expressed. So what has been happening, and this has been studied, we have had some time to study how this takes place. Typically, the fault lines in a society are between the rich and the poor, because migrants come in, and migrants are different. They shift the fault lines from a rich-poor one to a cultural rather than economic conflict. So a poor American can look at Trump and say, he's one of me, because he identifies between an us and a them and sees the similarities between the two of us Americans rather than the similarities between himself and an immigrant who's in exactly the same socioeconomic situation. And we also see that France has a smaller migrant population than Spain. France is about 12% population that's migrant, in Spain it's 14%. But France is far more in the news for anti-migrant sentiment. If we look at the composition of the migrants, the French migrants are predominantly Muslim Africans, people from Tunisia, Morocco. They are threatening at many levels. Spain, 2/3 of the migrants are either from Latin America or from elsewhere in Europe. They're overwhelmingly Christian, overwhelmingly Catholic. They often share the same language. So the opportunity to work into what Roderick calls, what is it, the cultural religious cleavage that a migrant introduces is just that much less in Spain. So to put it differently, innovation is a double-edged sword. It facilitates growth, but it makes people uncomfortable. It challenges the status quo. And especially if people are in a community of feeling vulnerable, they will very often identify the newcomers as the sources for this disease. And of course, politicians have a sense of where they need to respond, which I think is an important point to transition to talking about undocumented migrants. So countries at all levels of the global economic hierarchy have undocumented migrants. Migration is increasingly concentrated in a few high-income countries. It's really become more concentrated in the past 20 years or so. But there's still regional poles of migration. So in Africa, it's Cote d'Ivoire and South Africa. Latin America, it's Mexico and Brazil. And it's, where did I find that? Yes, sorry. And migrants will go to those countries if they can't get to the high-income countries. Obviously, you want to get to high-income countries if you can. But if you can't, if you experience your country is failing, for example, you will go to wherever else you can find a more secure livelihood. And in fact, a third of migrants in the world are in the global south and 75% of refugees. There are two themes that I think are quite important about undocumented migrants. And the first one has to do with the regulatory environment in which they find themselves. And the second one with how they earn a living. So undocumented migrant is preferred as a term over illegal migrant because we don't want to criminalize people who face a whole bunch of challenges. But it is a total misnomer because the documents that an undocumented migrant must navigate are staggering. So they face a range of changing categories and conditions, so much so that there's evidence of temporary migrants losing sight of what their visa status is. The requirements are often opaque and contradictory, even though bureaucrats are expected to give migrants certain documents and stuff as per their rights. They often exercise power by not giving it to them. When migrants are trying to legally migrate, they explain it as a stepwise process in what one researcher describes as agency in waiting. And because the eligibility criteria change so often, migrants often try and change their life trajectories to make sure that their life trajectories are coinciding with the changing visa conditions and that they would be eligible for regularizing their statuses. And this is not different in high versus lower income countries. So evidence about this happening comes from Canada, Australia, South Africa, Mexico. It's really incredibly difficult to be an undocumented migrant who is seeking to regularize your presence in a country, which raises the question, why do countries just not keep them out? Because it doesn't seem as if they really want to have them in the country. There's one reason why it always seems as if this is badly managed, and that is what is called the gaps between intent and what happens. It has a fancy name I now forget. The discursive gap is the one that happens first. A politician discurses certain dramatic statements, and there's a whole political and democratic process that ends up in a particular policy being promulgated. And obviously, there is a gap between the statements of any given politician and the policy that ends up on the law books. The next one is an implementation gap. Now that the policy is on the law books, how does that policy get implemented? Well, it depends on how many resources you give to it and what kind of officers you actually ask to implement the policy. And then the very last gap is the efficacy gap, which is how many migrants show up at what random point, and to what extent are the people who have been charged with implementing then able to deal with the inflow of migrants. So the first thing is that our sense that there's a massive gap between what's said and what has happened actually comes from very clearly predictable gaps between what is said and then happens, that happens along all three parts of the process. But if we look at the high income countries, in spite of the rhetoric against migrants, their policies have become generally more inclusive. They are more selective, which I think doesn't really happen a poor migrant from North Africa. But, they have aging populations, they need people, and the policies have actually not been more restrictive. Where policies are restrictive in the OECD countries, they do work by and large. There are three things that affect it. It's how restrictive the policy is. It's whether there's already a lot of migrants in a country, a stock of migrants, and unemployment. Now, the skeptic can say, well, if there's unemployment in a country, a migrant doesn't really want to go and be unemployed in a different country. But that's also when politicians really don't want migrants coming into the country. And it's thought that the stock of migrants who are already in the country are probably the mechanism that shares the message to make sure that the migrants the individuals who are considering migrating know that it's a good place to go to or not. So we know for the OECD high-income countries where institutions generally work, that their policies about migrants generally work. What about middle-income countries? Well, what we see is, first of all, the research is always less comprehensive. The research that is out there suggests that in an area like Latin America, the rhetoric is often very inclusive. We want to embrace migrants, etc. The policies are far more exclusive. We don't actually know whether those policies work that well, but we have a fair idea as citizens or inhabitants of a middle-income country about the effectiveness of policies generally and implementation of policies. So the institutional dysfunction that is characteristic of middle-income countries probably holds there too, and it probably functions less effectively than in the case of the high-income countries. So let's look at how undocumented migrants make a living. We know a lot about undocumented migrants and their education and their health, because they engage with educational institutions and health institutions, and those institutions can then be sources of systematic evidence. So we know in terms of education, they are extremely stressed. We know in terms of health, they are weirdly healthy. It's probably a selection gap bias. If you're not healthy, you're not planning to be an undocumented migrant, you need your monthly meds, and Clicks is not going to deliver it to you in a foreign country where you're not documented, you just don't go. But they take every precaution to not engage systematically with an entity that can capture them working, earning a living. So it's hard to figure out what exactly they do. In high-income countries, because your institutions function well, your economy is competitive, but your labor is very expensive, we see that your undocumented migrants tend to perform invisible work, which places them in a very difficult situation because they are invisible in the workplace and hypervisible in society at large. So a study of construction workers in the US has found that many of these workers don't have formal skills, but they brought with them from home some skills and learn on the job some skills. So there's a clear sort of taxonomy of skills amongst the construction workers of what they can do. And a study also on construction workers in the Netherlands found that these workers probably acquire these skills in part because they are extremely vigilant. They observe what's happening on in labor and in the places where they work because their safety relies on that. Spain is a really instructive example of what happens when you regularize undocumented migrants. And it was a fluke, a natural experiment. Towards the end of 24, there was a very bad terrorist attack in Spain. The leading political party that everybody, and it was 2 days before the general elections, the party everybody who thought would win the election was booted out. A left-wing party was voted in, and that party suddenly and without any prior warning said any migrant who was undocumented, who had been in the country in a job, formal or not, and it was informal by and large, but with a formal or informal establishment or not, and had no crime record, could be legalized. And overnight, they added 600,000 workers, which represented 3% of the total labor force, to their labor market. It's now 20 years later, and it's possible to see what had happened in Spain because of that. There was no additional expenditure from the public side in terms of health or schooling or whatever. There was no additional unemployment anywhere. There was greater formalization in the economy, and the average increase in tax returns per regularized worker was 4,000 euro per annum, so per individual. So by regularizing these people, the country gained a massive amount of tax revenues from people who were there in the country already, doing the work that they had been doing in the country already. It seems that in many cases, the work that they were done was simply absorbed into the formal sector. So it seems that undocumented workers, in a similar way, and probably for similar reasons, they bring diversity and they are there on a self-selected basis, we're also adding value in the context of a high-income country, i.e. Spain, and probably do so more generally. We know much less about undocumented workers and how they earn a living in a country like South Africa. So we know entrepreneurship matters, especially if they can be offering entrepreneurial services to people from their home country, often either things like services like food or transportation home or something like that. Because this provides both economic benefits, but also some source of social support. This is their people and they can hang out with these people. We also are in contexts where there are often institutional voids, and undocumented workers often step in to fill those institutional voids. So, for example, recycling or rubbish removal would be typical ones. Because they're excluded from formal banking, they have stokvel type arrangements to support each other through hardship, and burial societies is a particularly important one because bodies need to be repatriated home. And some of these burial societies work on a ad hoc basis. If somebody were to die, we fundraise in the moment, but some of them have a monthly subscription. And in those cases, if there's excess funds, the members of the Stokvel will decide how to use that money. And there are two functions for which the money is used. The first is for investment opportunities. Recyclers may decide to invest in a baler because then they increase the economic viability of the entire business. But there's also what I call institutional insurance, where they offer, for example, interest-free loans to sympathetic employees at host country institutions, so nurses in South African clinics, so that the nurses can inform them when somebody is sick where they can take their child. The nurse gets the interest-free loan, and the migrants gets information about where they will not be turned away around if they show up with a sick child. The transactions are cash-based, and the pervasive informality of the migrant world, but also the African general context, means that I don't think we will really get a handle about what has happened until we understand that. I want to close just with what I'm not covering. There are a few cases of unusual migration where we don't have a sending country and a receiving country. We have return migration, and I'll happy to speak about return migration and when migrants come back or not. There's onward migration, people who just never settle and keep on moving on to the next one. We have diasporas who may or may not be migrants. Some members of the whole Irish diaspora in the US have been born in the US. They're not really migrants, but they see themselves as Irish, and that has profound implications for how they invest, for example. And then digital migrants, which is a personal pet peeve of me, because I need to break the news to you that one cannot immigrate to the cloud, the digital world, or the metaverse, because those things are metaphors. What I want to say, those are combinations on the same theme in the sense that it's a voluntary move. And what I didn't talk about, and which I'm not comfortable talking about, is involuntary migration. The United Nations defines migration as a person who has changed his or her country of residence, regardless of their legal status or nature or motive of their movement. And that means that victims of human trafficking are migrants and refugees are migrants. And I keep on saying there are these wonderful benefits of migrants that come from the fact that they self-select, but none of these people have selected to migrant. They were forced into it. So there is evidence that people who involuntarily migrate have exceptionally successful careers in their home countries. But I have a colleague who lived through the 1,425 days of the siege of Sarajevo, who's working on a paper about what it does to the migrant experience there. And it's on the so manyth round of review, and she said, the editor said to her, but what about the literature on trauma? What about the literature on post-traumatic stress? What about the literature about intergenerational trauma? And all of those very difficult topics, which led her in tears during a presentation, which she felt quite embarrassed about, which I would not have been. Because I think they point to the fact that if people have been displaced against their will, we're probably looking at a very different kettle of fish. I think I want to stop there. It's a massive topic. When we talk about levels of analysis in our world, you need to choose? Is it the individual? Is it the firm, the industry? And then you have to talk at that level of analysis. We're talking here about an individual, but it's not the team or the co-workers or the leader or whatever. It's against another country. It's against a place with informal and formal rules of the game of millions or dozens of millions or hundreds of millions of other people. And I think it's that juxtaposition that makes it so interesting for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Helena. I think don't leave here. So my job now is to facilitate questions, but knowing Helena and her expertise in classroom management and facilitation, I suspect that I'm superfluous and that you, Helena, are very capable of taking any questions that come from the audience. So I'm going to hand over to you for that purpose, if I may.
You can talk to me afterwards if it doesn't work. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks, Helena. A very interesting topic. You can hear from my accent that I'm Irish. I came here 40 years ago, so hence my question. Clearly, with improved modes of mobility and with increased information, it's possible and it's a reality that humankind is probably moving more now than ever before. And yeah, there are various reasons for that. Tourism is one, but migration, as whatever way it's defined, is another. But what I'm curious to hear is your view as to when does a migrant stop being a migrant? When are you a non-migrant? In other words, how long do you need to be in a country before you're not a migrant anymore? Or are there certain criteria? You must become a citizen, you must have bought a property, or how do you look on that issue? And then, yeah, you mentioned that you haven't spoken about migrants who go back to where they came from. So when they go back to where they came from, are they now a migrant in where they came from? I'd be interested to hear your views.
So I actually am planning a research project about when one stops being a migrant with a guy of Indian descent whose family had lived for generations in East Africa and who left during the era of Idi Amin and Uganda. I don't have the question to that. My suspicion is that you need to be an insider rather than an outsider. I think it's not about being foreign or not, it's about being an insider. But I need to come back to you on that. About return migration, when you return, you are indeed, for the first time at least, a migrant again, and carry with you the same benefits as you had when you first left. So the return migrants bring great novelty. If we look at the evidence, they facilitate exports, they facilitate venture capital access, they strengthen science systems. These are people who are, girls like me who grew up in Pretoria and come back, or business people or whatever. And it is because having lived abroad, new things were learned that can then be usefully shared coming back home. The difficulty is that whenever you introduce innovation, it's an implicit critique of what is. The fact that we can do it better means the way it has been done before is not so good. And in China, because China is China, there's a science park that the government has officials where they facilitate any red tape that you may encounter or obstacles, and they provide support, and you have a bunch of other people you can work with who can help you overcome that inertia. What we see in a country like Kenya, which is Kenya, is that the individual returnee has to carry the burden on themselves. So you want to do things in a different way? Well, you say it's better, figure out how you're going to convince me about it. So there's a much greater burden on the individual migrant if the state is not particularly supportive. Okay. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation this evening. My name is Diego Iturralde. I'm from Statistics South Africa. I think I was mentioning to you before you spoke that your talk comes at a very important time, or a very interesting time, when anti-migrant sentiment in South Africa is at an all-time high. There are very strong social movements against migrants, particularly in accessing health, in accessing education. And we don't know where all this will stop. And there seems to be an alternative truth that is flourishing on the streets, an alternative truth that is driven by people with a large social media following, or with a vested interest in deviating our thinking to something else than what the reality is suggesting it should be. And my question to you is, given the dearth of information that we have around us, whether it's statistics being collected, research being collated by researchers like yourself, and what would the contribution or the approach be from a leading senior researcher like yourself to try and turn that alternative reality, alternative truth that we see on the streets, that is misguiding, misinforming, and misdirecting the national narrative, to something that is more aligned to what the reality suggests it is? Thank you.
Thanks. If you deal with a context where the national tensions have shifted from essentially between rich and poor, which I think in South Africa is where it should be, given that terrible inequality, to us and them, that is where it is at the moment. And I think to address that, you need to engage and make it real to the people who are holding those views. There's a reason why people believe the way they believe. And this could be because there are influences out there, but it could be because they see a person who is talking a different language, charging them, you know, selling them food that kills children. Let's put it in the context of the recent scandal. So I think one of the projects that I've been working on is how do we experimentally do work where people get an opportunity to reflect about who are the migrants in my life and what's my relationship with them, and then see if people respond differently. But I think what's essentially happened is it becomes incredibly easy to have these broad narratives, and we need to go back to the individual experiences of where these truths come from. I think it was a very interesting comment made by a German colleague whose dad was not German, but he grew up, his dad was a communist Brit, and he married a East German woman. So Manning grew up in East Germany. This is German as they come. And somebody was commenting about these idiot, weird, ridiculous sort of right-wing German voters. And he said, are you seeing the views of 20% of the German population as idiots? Or are we trying to understand what is driving those views? And I think it's really important for us to understand what's driving those views, rather than to say this is misinformed. It's easy for me to say they're misinformed, but I have food. and we don't have food security across the country. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Sibusiso. I'm from Diepsloot, and I am in construction, or was in construction. And I've noted during your presentation that you referred a lot to the construction sector. And having gone through or living through the experiences of the impact of migrants in the sector myself, you know, having seen this, the sector shrink in terms of opportunities, not entirely because of migrants. There's also economic, the fact that our country is not growing at the rate to create enough employment, but certainly an impact that the migrants have. In your opinion, what role do you think in our current juncture can be played by business in the main in bringing the parties together? Because at the end of the day, we're all fighting for bread, and we will continue to do so. So all this noise is made by lack of bread, for lack of describing it properly. So my question is, what role do you think business could play, or big business? Because my view is that there's a reliance on government to do more to deal with that issue. And in reality is that our current government, their hands are a bit tight, or they cannot do much. So what is your role in that? And maybe the second question is, and maybe it's to put you on the spot, that the quote that you quoted of 1963, do you think we are at that point where we must curtail migration? Thank you.
So I'll answer the second one first. It was a very critical point that the author made. He said, this is the view that is often expressed. It's not a good idea to curtail migration, because migration brings more benefits than challenges. It's important to manage the migration. So when Hungary imports factory workers, to import Catholics so that they can settle in the old Hungarian villages and go to mass and have Filipino food at the end of mass rather than Hungarian food, or maybe together, but that there's cultural coherence. So a positive and sensible approach to migration rather than curtailing migration is almost always by far the best. In terms of the role, I think I want to answer on behalf of Gibbs, and any of my colleagues here could correct me if I'm wrong. Gibbs's view is very strongly that business is necessary to drive economic growth. And Gibbs's view is that business cannot just be the multinationals, the foreign multinationals, the South African multinationals, but you need to take an ecosystem view and also support entrepreneurial ventures, also support social entrepreneurs to really think in terms of growing not one part of the cake, but to grow all the different sectors. And it's important for me, as I speak about this migration story, to keep on going back to the economic impact that the migrants have, and not any of the other ones. So I don't speak that much about some of the sociological parts or anthropological parts of stuff, because for Gibbs, it's really, so what do they do to earn a living? That's what Gibbs is interested in, is the part with the Rand sign. But at the same time, we need to understand that for us to build a society, we need money. And I have a colleague who's from Nigeria, and he says, all we need is 50 unicorns from Africa. And if you tax them, we can stop worrying about aid. And somebody's like, 50 unicorns from Africa. And he says, I know it's ambitious, but wouldn't it be nice to get rid of aid agencies? And I think that Absolutely. If we can come together around the goal of let's have partners work together to build an economy, Gibbs is there. There was a hand there. Yeah.
Thanks, Prof. This was truly, I mean, a very insightful session. So when I came here, I came with a very narrow perspective about migration, and you really broadened my perspective on this issue. You've given us statistics and scenarios from other countries. You've given us a global perspective. So when you're talking about Spain, how they've formalized undocumented immigrants, and they've benefited hugely from tax revenues and in other ways, I was just thinking to myself, this is something that obviously could be replicated in South Africa, because I believe that we've benefited from undocumented immigration economically. I believe we've benefited. So I was thinking if it's something that we can also replicate in South Africa, but I'm saying to myself, would it not be selfish to the nationals from those countries where they've seen immigration into South Africa? Because often at times, like you've said, it's due to the regulatory environment and the income earning potential. So we have socioeconomic issues from those countries that have their nationals coming into countries like South Africa and Mexico and the likes. So are we not normalizing and perpetuating the social ills that have pushed those nationals out of their countries, especially if we're not doing anything about those issues?
So we had all kinds of theories about why people return to their home country. And Europe is quite keen to figure out why do people return to their home country. So they partnered, the German government partnered with the OECD and did a study about why people return. They miss their families, they're homesick, they have family obligations. The other dimensions, if they have the right to re-immigrate back to that country, they will. So if you take away their work rights, if they leave, they won't leave. And it seems after 10 years is a bit of an inflection point. If they've been in a country for 10 years, they stay there. But it's hard to immigrate. And very often people will be in a different country and then go home. And so I think that people who live in poorer countries, who come into a richer country, work here, and remember it's a richer country because institutions are better developed. We are not as well developed as the US, but we have a number of really high quality institutions. And therefore, there's stuff to learn here that people then can use when they go back to their home countries. The evidence is that people do not necessarily stay. They sometimes do. So I think normalizing migration is actually the way to do it. When the US imported 30 million people over the course of a 70-year period, that's an enormous amount of people. They normalized migration, even though people were getting a bit nervous. It's like, you know, this is an excess of labor. By the time you've imported 30 million people, that's half of South Africa that are migrants. But the point is that if we do that and people show up here because they come from poor countries, they will miss home, they will go home, some of them, and they will take with them back home the learnings that they've gained here. So I don't see it would be necessarily a problem.
Good evening. My question is more on the what do you call it, in the log sheets at places like Hammanskraal and so forth. So what I'm asking is that, like, what happened previously, we used to have like spaza shops, which were owned by our, like, South Africans, I would say. And then it happened currently, I think didn't start, it started over some years whereby migrants would come, set up their own shops there, and then the way in which they support each other in establishing this meant that those spaza shops now are no longer functioning, basically. So my question is, what would on a what do you call it, community level, what do you think could be done? Because the challenge is, as much as they come here for opportunities, the people that are there, locals, are also dependent on those particular spaza shops to also like make a living. And then currently they can't survive, basically, because like the way it happens is these people are like they are grouped together. There's a lot of unity in how they do it. They will say this is they will help you build up a shop, get everything there, and then once you are fine and everything's working fine, and then you'll also help another one. So it's like pockets of them all over. So yeah, that's the question that I have. What kind of community level? More on the business, but on a community level, that's more where my interest is.
So I'll answer you indirectly. When we look at multinationals entering a less developed country, multinationals very often come, they are international brands, they have international backing, they have international, marketing offices, international budgets, and there's a South African firm, and the South African firm has to somehow survive. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. The famous cases where the multinational doesn't make it, SAB didn't make it in Kenya. Kenya kicked them out. But there are also famous cases, sad cases, where local firms go under. And basically, business is competitive. And if it's possible for the entry of foreign entrants to stimulate improved performance, then the entry of foreign participants is a good thing, because it triggers a competitive edge, it triggers a kind of a rivalry, it triggers a way to best service customers. So it should technically improve competition for all, because sometimes the foreigners get kicked out and sometimes the local businesses go under. I think what happened in many of these local communities is there was a very strong community embedded nature to these businesses, where these businesses were thinking of themselves in terms of community services almost as much as businesses that are operating in terms of practices. And I know some of the projects that we've done with some of these enterprises were working in groups of firms that were deliberately, of these small community firms, that were deliberately chosen to be complementary. And it took up to the 4th or 5th session before these businesses realized, but we could offer complementary services to each other. So there was a profound lack of business savvy in these South African businesses, where they were really not used to thinking of themselves in that kind of business environment. And then you bring in migrants who are there to earn a better living. All they think about is business, because they want to earn a better living, and they don't have a sense of community. Their community is 10,000 kilometers away. So obviously it is going to bring huge frustrations. And I think that is where the roots of that tension came from. But in the end, we need to grow. We need to have those community entities see opportunities where they can actually offer complementary services to each other and grow into viable competitors and service providers inside these communities. Because at the moment, you go to Bushbuck Ridge, you go to Hammanskraal, you find the same types of organizations, you find the same types of strategies, you find the same range of services. You're not seeing the diversity that you would expect if you're going to businesses that are seeking to compete to meet unique market needs. I think one more question. Yeah. Okay. Two more. Okay. Patiswa and you. I'll get to you. Okay. Outside in apparently freezing cold.
Oh, okay.
I can hear you.
Yesterday I was watching BBC and they were showing how, people are trying to cross from Northern Africa to, Italy and France and so forth. Fascinating enough is that they do an underground documentary, so sophisticated journalists who goes into the whole thing and tries to understand. One of the findings is that this whole thing is run by a very, organized hotel. The people who are paid, they transport people, they run the logistics and so forth. So when you talk about migration, at what point have we, and I'm asking this because I felt like there was nothing that the police system could do. It sees the people coming through, and then the police can't do much. They're not arresting them, they're not blocking them from entering the country. So it's quite fascinating to me that, and I'm thinking about just human evolution, that, we come from a stateless world where humans move, species move, animals move when the, things change. And then we introduced, whether it was slavery, colonialism, and then you ended up with, lines that, now define states. Is the state concept the right way to study this thing and to try and find solutions to this thing? And I just feel like the whole mechanism or structure of trying to understand this is maybe more complex and less tidy than we think it is. As I'm saying, organized crime. I haven't seen much about organized crime, especially like in South Africa. We have heroin in South Africa. You don't have clear studies of how this heroin moves, comes into the country, destroys communities. It doesn't, you can't study it enough. I have a friend who had to move to the Middle East because she's a whistleblower. Again, how do you capture such migrants who don't want to leave their country but are not literally, war, victims? So she can't be a refugee in the Middle East. She has to still have a qualification, work as a professional person. But it's completely against the will. It's like the world does not have rules of now dealing with this new dynamics. And the craziest one was Swaziland and Rwanda taking prisoners from other countries. And now we're going to have, a different form of migration of prisoners. But even more interesting for me is the whole sustainable development question. We're going to have, they say by 2050, the global south is going to move to the north. It's inevitable. The temperatures are changing. We're going to be more colder. They're going to be more warmer. So the population of the world is moving north. Whether by environment or whatever. So it might not be a question. It's just a commentary. I just feel like
so
complex. But thank you so much for the presentation.
So I didn't want to touch on organized crime. I mean, that's such a big detour. But I think one of the reasons why you want to avoid limiting migration and rather have a policy that encourages it within sensible guidelines is precisely the moment you prohibit something, you create an underground. There's, of course, human trafficking. This is another dimension which I didn't talk on, but absolutely. There's a huge criminal dimension in terms of moving people against their wills and moving people freely who have no other ways. Patiswa?
Thank you for the insightful presentation. And I think for me, it's what I was dealing with on Monday. It's just timely for me. And I think I'm going to be cleverer next week when I engage with the SA refugee-led network. On Monday, I was with Lawyers for Human Rights, dealing with migrant issues, but relating to the media and how their stories are told without their voices. And the complication is that, as you were saying, undocumented migrants tend to not want to be seen, but they still want to have their stories reflected in the news coverage because their issues have to be out there, but they don't want to be seen. And it's difficult to tell those stories. And then on the other hand, you have all this disinformation. I think Diego was referring to alternative facts that you find in the news environment, where there's disinformation or misrepresentation of what their stories are about. To the extent that even the language that the news environment uses, where migrants, particularly undocumented migrants, are referred to as illegal immigrants and foreign nationals in some of the instances, and the default is always, where tensions are concerned, xenophobia, without actually raising and pointing out the actual concerns by the locals against undocumented migrants. So the new thing, which is why I've been invited to speak to the group on Monday, they are concerned about the upcoming 2026 local government elections, because in the previous election, migrant issues had become a campaigning point for some of the political parties, so they are worried about the fact that they are going to be exposed to violence if that happens again. And already there are tensions between the two elections in terms of how the spaza shop issue played out beginning of this year, and I think sometime last year. So they are concerned about what's going on. So the complexity of how they get to navigate the spaces in the host country being South Africa and how they are reflected in the media is something that we are struggling to deal with. So I'm meeting with them, but I think I'm better informed with some of the information that you've shared.
I'm glad. The material on refugees it really overwhelms me, because the stories get very hard to deal with. So I have some references, but it's not, I like the more cheerful stories.
So I'm going to abuse my position as, I've just looked at the program, guys. I'm the director. And just make a quick comment about something that struck me. There was a story in somewhere, I don't know, I read too many newspapers, about a community in sort of Midwest America, where people who had voted for Trump and were very strongly in support of moving migrants out of their community were very upset when their local migrant was moved out of their community, because it was someone who they were quite close to, because I think she was a teacher at the primary school or something, and now it was their child's teacher who'd been gone. And I think that this issue of labeling groups of people versus knowing individuals of people is something you were alluding to at the end of your lecture. And maybe that's a challenge to us as human beings, generally speaking. I don't know. That's just my thought. But I want to say it's such a thought-provoking talk, Helena. And they say that you can't hold an audience for more than 7 minutes, but you held us for 47 minutes. And it was really interesting. And thank you very much for bringing so much richness to a very complex subject. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Very much.
Apparently it's freezing outside, and I apologize on behalf of Johannesburg for the unseasonable weather. It's not supposed to be like this by now, but we do have refreshments. So we welcome you to join us outside if you have further questions. I know my colleague, and she's always very happy to converse. So please do join us outside for more conversation. And thank you for your attendance this evening, everyone. Thank you.